Hey.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you as well.
Oh, there's Jess.
Hi, Ellen.
Hi, how are you?
Good. We're muting ourselves now. Hi, Kristen.
How many panels are you doing this week, Leah?
Let's see. No. Keeps me on my toes.
I'm sure you're popular right now. I'm sure there must be a lot of requests.
Another talk on Tuesday with a group from NJEA. So.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
What group from NJEA?
Minority Leaders of Color Committee, I believe it's called.
Oh, great. Okay.
I see Kristen nodding. Okay. They're focused on recruitment and retainment is one of the major purposes for them of teachers of color.
Uh-huh. That's awesome. Let's see. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Well, we're going to take several minutes to let everybody arrive. Okay. So relax, go get your cup of whatever you're drinking and we'll be starting soon.
Shout out to Betty, another new caucus member.
Yes.
See, here's one. Joining. There's two.
Hi, Ellen. It's Esther.
Hi, Esther. How are you?
I'm okay. And you?
Good.
Everything good? Good.
Yeah. Okay, we're up to 22 people on now. Let's see. People are still adding. Give it a couple more minutes.
Oh, Ellen, if you want to make me a co-host, I can let people in, while the coffee house is going.
Okay, will do. Okay, let's give it one more minute. Okay. Okay. I know some more are coming, but maybe I'll start with the introductions, okay? Let's see if I can see this. Kathy, can you see them? Yeah. Okay,
Yep.
good. Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks. Okay. So good evening, everybody. So my name is Ellen Witt. I'm with the Central Jersey Coalition Against Endless War, which organized tonight's event. So for those of you who are not familiar with us, the coalition has actually been around since 2002. We were founded originally to oppose the Iraq War. And since that time, we've actually worked on a lot of different issues. In addition to anti-war stuff, we've worked on climate change, immigrant and labor rights, fights against police brutality, against racism. So from our perspective, we view all these issues as part of the larger endless war on working people, both here and abroad. So we put out a list of announcements of events that are happening in this sort of in New Jersey area, and sometimes beyond each week. So any of you who would like to join our weekly email announcement list, you can do that by going to our website. Our website is againstendlesswar.org. And there's a button there that says join our mailing list, something like that. And you can join our mailing list there. We promise we don't send out a lot of stuff. It's just a once a week email that lists what's going on, not just our events, but a lot of other groups' events. So if you're part of a group that's doing a political type of event and want to let us know, we are nonpartisan though, so we don't do like different political parties, but issues that people or community is organizing around, that kind of thing, be great. You can also join our Facebook page, Central Jersey Coalition Against Endless War Facebook page. And there you can post things yourself. So if there are things going on that you want other people to know about, you can utilize that and help mobilize people to support things that you're working on. So we actually started Mark's Place Coffee House in 2006, and that's what this is a program of, Mark's Place Coffee House, which was really to provide a place for people to get together, to discuss important issues that are happening. So we have speakers on different topics regularly, and then each event after the speakers speak, we make it possible for people to contribute to the discussion. So it's named Mark's Place Coffee House because it's named after one of our founding members, Mark Shapiro, who died in 2005. So we started it the following year and it's been going ever since. So obviously it used to be in person and we hope someday it will be in person again. But for right now, during COVID, we've just been doing it by Zoom. So that's what's happening. So tonight we have 3 speakers to speak on the topic of critical race theory, a discussion with educators. And we're going to let each of them speak for a few minutes to share their thoughts. So we'll have them all speak. And then after they've all spoken, we'll open the floor to discussion. You'll have the opportunity to not just put something in the chat, but I'll call on people. And if you can just make your comments brief, we can all be part of this discussion. So, but for right now, I'd like to ask everyone to make sure that you are muted. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a mute button. So please mute yourself. And if you don't, you might get muted by me. So go ahead and mute now. And you can also note at the bottom of the screen, there's a place where it says reactions. If you want to give a little clap, you can clap under reactions. You can also raise your hand when you want to make a comment in the discussion. Okay. All right. So tonight we're going to open up with, we're just really happy to have this great panel of 3 speakers who are in education, know what's going on from different places and different points of view. So I want to open up with Dr. Leah Owens, who is an educator, writer, and activist scholar, who also holds an anti-racist worldview. So I'm really happy to connect with her again and hear what she has to say tonight. So please, let's give a hand to Leah.
Thank you, Ellen. Good evening, everyone. I'm super excited to be here. I don't even remember how many years ago it was, and I kind of don't really want to count, but I did come back in the age pre-COVID at one point and talk at the coffee house. So it's really great to be back. Certainly have learned a lot of things in the meantime. So I'm gonna just drop in the chat the link to the slides that I'm about to share. So please feel free to open those up if you would like, and we will make them large on the screen. All right, so let me hit my timer so I also know how long I'm talking. So Ellen asked me to open up and kind of frame what's going on with critical race theory and what it is first and foremost, just in case there are folks who may not have that understanding, and also to inform our discussion. And we're going to talk about why it's under attack, the strategies that are being used. I want to show a little bit about the results of the November elections and talk about what that means. And then I'm imagining the last two questions kind of all the panelists will kind of speak to that, / that'll be the part of the greater discussion. So what is critical race theory? So I have a quote there, a large quote there, block quote, coming from an article, recent article in the New York Times. Anything that's underlined is something that can be clicked on. So again, feel free to explore the slides as we're all talking during the session or later on if you would like. But essentially, critical race theory grew out of legal studies field in the 70s, particularly with legal scholar Derek Bell, who has since passed about 10 years or so ago at this point. And so over the years, it stayed in the legal field space until a little bit about 20 so years later, where it moved into education as well. And critical race theory has shown up in all different types of disciplines. But of course, we're focusing on education today. So we have a quote there from Mary Matsuda, and if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. But critical race theory focuses on institutions and systems. Critical race theorists look at how the law has had a disproportionate impact on people of color, particularly Black folks, at least in the beginning conversations, but we know a lot of conversations about Black and white. But now we talk about a diversity of people, but the impact of the law and the fact that it's not neutral, again, there is a disproportionate and unequal impact on people of color. These are the core tenets of CRT, again, as they've developed over sort of the last 50 or so years in existence. And so just quickly want to talk a little bit about a couple of them in context of the scholars that I had on the previous slide. So Derek Bell really started writing about this idea of interest convergence when he critiqued the decision of Brown versus Board of Education, right, which said the Supreme Court of the United States in 1954 ruled that separate could not be equal when it comes, it comes to anything, right? It's the Supreme Court, federal court of the land, but particularly that was the education case. And so Bell argued that Brown was not actually decided in that manner because folks in the power structure were concerned about the type of education that Black children were receiving. He argued that it was actually decided in that manner because the United States was concerned about the way it was viewed by other countries and powers around the world, particularly after World War II. So this idea that the Brown decision actually was more about how it can have a positive impact for the white power structure. So this idea of interest convergence. So whenever the white power structure can actually benefit from a decision, some sort of legal decision, then it actually is, that's more of the reason why it's decided than the fact that it's going to help people of color, people of different genders, so on and so forth. And so another one I wanted to point out, sure I look at my note here, is intersectionality. So again, another one of the critical race theorists on the previous slide, Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a co-director of the African American Policy Forum, coined the campaign hashtag Say Her Name. So as Black Lives Matter got started, now we're looking at 10 years ago, she recognized and was speaking up about the fact that we weren't paying as much attention to the Black women who were also being murdered. So Black women, trans women who are also being murdered. So the idea of intersectionality is saying not just looking at one identity, but actually how all different, how an individual's different identities has an impact on the way that the law or policies apply to them. And as we're talking, if there's any of these other ones you want to talk particularly about, please feel free to ask that question. But again, you have the slides and I only have so much time. And so kind of to round up, what is critical race theory? This is one of the slides that my co-director and I, Dr. Brandy Wade, who's also on, put together for some sessions that we're leading for the Rutgers Graduate School of Education. Some of the folks that they have that are part of what's called the Community Engaged Anti-Racist Project, so shout out to GSC, and also diversifying the teacher profession. And so you can see our information down there about Radical Pedagogy Institute, which we organize professional development in this space for pre-service and in-service teachers. So when it comes to education, critical race theory in particular looks at how policies and practices contribute to persistent racial inequalities. So in 1995, Gloria Ladson-Billings published an article that talked about how critical race theory could be applied to education. And she has been cited thousands and thousands and thousands of times, and is also someone who first wrote about the idea of culturally relevant pedagogy, which is something that I think most teachers have at least heard of if they don't implement for themselves. But it actually is connected to critical race theory. So this idea of looking at the historical and cultural backgrounds of our students in order to serve them better and to make sure that the curriculum is connecting to their lived experiences. So why is critical race theory under attack, right? Are parents really concerned, are white parents really concerned about what is being taught in schools? And I've seen a couple of interviews with different folks, whether they're everyday people, scholars, elected officials, where the interviewer is actually asking them, what is critical race theory? Just that straightforward question. Some of my favorite interviews in that sense have been conducted by Mark Lamont Hill on the Black News Channel, who has had, again, several folks on, and they never directly answer the question. They always kind of say, well, it is divisive. They have all this rhetoric, which is some information on some of the subsequent slides. They have this rhetoric about what it is, but they never really talk about the information that I just talked about in the first few slides, how it's theory in academia, how it's about studying the racist roots of this country, and essentially just telling the truth about the history and how this country was developed. So what is it really about? So Dr. Brittany Cooper has spoken quite recently extensively about critical race theory and how it's really about the right or the conservatives' long game. So a lot of folks are pointing to the midterm elections in 2022 and saying that this past November election was kind of like a test to see if they can continue to ride on this wave and use it in next year's elections to be able to regain more control in Congress in particular, but also other legislatures and governorships around the country. I think probably most people in here are familiar with the fact that Virginia had a win in terms of anti-CRT folks with Youngkin. So it's really about the long game. So what is their strategy? The next few slides come from in Toolkit around the attacks on critical race theory. And again, the link is in, well, not again, this time the link is in the notes at the bottom. So please check out that toolkit. But this is going to probably be familiar for a lot of folks in here as well. Again, this is a long game. This is not something that just popped up or new folks who are really organizing this movement behind anti-CRT. We see the same players who are involved in neoliberal education reform and privatizing the public school system. They create boilerplate policies, boilerplate parent letters, boilerplate school board campaigns to help folks to actually gain positions of power so they can continue to push, again, this language, this rhetoric around talking about race being inherently divisive, that systemic racism is not real, that racism is all about individual acts, and it's really about how do we stop individual people from hating each other, and not that the fact that it's an institutional power structure that's the problem. So again, to my point about the boilerplate policies and parent letters that they make freely available to folks who want to organize in this movement. Which one did I want to put? So I wanted to point out this point at the bottom here. So one of these, again, examples of rhetoric that's being used, equity policy. Anti-CRTers are taking anything that is remotely connected to diversity, equity, inclusion, including social emotional learning, and saying that all of this has to do with critical race theory being taught in the schools, and that we need to ban books, we need to pass laws to make sure that this isn't happening. So one parent and mother in Colorado says equity policy is the same as critical race theory. And the reason why it's so damaging is it divides students into groups. It is not the same as equality or equal opportunity, which is what every parent is for and what the civil rights movement was for. So in the 80s and 90s, equality was the buzz term for education policy reform, and then which ultimately led to No Child Left Behind, which one of the pieces of that legislation was that we needed to disaggregate the standardized testing data so that we can actually see how different groups of students are being, how they're doing on the test, right? And so now in the 2000s, right, 2010s, now in 2020, equity is the buzz term. And so, yes, equity is connected to critical race theory. I don't necessarily disagree with her on this point. However, the idea that it is damaging is very misleading, because if we are talking about equality as well, then we need to look at what we need to do for each different group of students to make sure that they're able to succeed. And that's not necessarily going to be equality. Equality is not, that doesn't necessarily look like equality. It's not about giving each student the same exact thing. It's about giving them what they need in order for them to succeed. So how can that be a terrible thing? So this is a map of the election results for the governor's race. Again, I'm imagining most folks here in this room are familiar with this. Hopefully some other folks can chime in or put in the chat if you have some ideas about how these results have looked over time. I did learn during this election that New Jersey has never had a Democratic governor get re-elected. So please correct that if that is wrong, but that's something that I heard during the campaign. So the fact that Governor Murphy basically won with 50% of the votes, I mean, it was so close, is something that we're going to have to pay attention to. I know that there are some folks, again, who probably speak to local school board elections. I'm in Newark. It wasn't an issue back in April. We still have elections in April for our school board candidates. Of course, our context is different, but please, please, please feel free when we get into the discussion to talk about what's happening in your space locally. But the more red, the darker the red color, the more that county went towards Republicans. And then the more blue, the more those counties went towards Democrats. So again, we see that it's kind of pretty much split 50-50, and we can't necessarily think that this is going to get better. So I'm gonna stop there and pass it on to, oh great, I see some things popped up in the chat. Pass it back to Ellen.
Okay, awesome. So I'll give you a little hand if everybody can use their response thing to give a little clap. But so next we're going to have Kristen Clarke. She's a high school math teacher and member of the New Jersey Education Association. She's also a member of the strategy team for NJ21 United, which I'll let her explain what that is.
Yeah. Hey, thank you, Ellen. And thank you, Leah. That was super informative. I definitely learned a lot from that as well. And a lot of it touches on what I'm going to dive into. But first, like Ellen said, my name's Kristen. I am a high school math teacher in Monmouth County on the shore. And I'm actually super fortunate. I get to work in a school of social justice, which is just amazing to get to blend kind of real world social justice topics from a mathematical perspective. which I think is important in the classroom. And then on top of that, I am also a member of NJ21 United. We are a coalition of public school employees and community members from around the state. We do tend to mostly represent NJEA members, but we're open to everyone. It's everyone who cares about public education and public workers in the state of New Jersey. While most of our work is focused on education, we are cognizant of how intersectional everything is and how education is just one piece of the injustices that we see in our society. So NJ21 is also a member of a few coalitions that we're really proud to work with. The first is the Protect NJ Workers Coalition. It's a multicultural, multi-sector coalition of workers across New Jersey that was formed at the beginning of the COVID pandemic to band together and see what was happening and how we could stand together as a group of workers and protect one another. And through that, we were super fortunate to get grant funding through the state of New Jersey to do health and safety trainings for workers. NJ21 United trained just about 700 public school workers across the state, and the coalition as a whole trained over 3,000 workers. So it's just work that we're really proud of. We're also a member of the Police Free Schools Coalition that is headed up by Make the Road New Jersey, because again, getting police out of schools just really, to me, goes hand in hand with critical race theory. We know that things like zero tolerance policies in education disproportionately affect students of color and students from low-income backgrounds. And that's kind of the work that we do in NJ21 United. We also this summer put together an honesty and education toolkit that I'm going to try and share my screen right now to show you guys. So just hang with me. I'm actually surprisingly not great with Zoom because I taught with Google Classroom and Google Meet last year. So let's do this. Here we go.
Oh, at the bottom is, you found it? Okay, good.
I think I got it. Do you guys see it?
Yes, yes.
Okay, cool. Thanks. So this is our honesty and education toolkit, and it's Teach the Truth. We put this together over the summer, NJ21 United members, as part of the Zen Education and Black Lives Matter at School Week of Action. We wanted educators in New Jersey to be ready for the attacks that we know are coming. Because at its core, just like Leah said, this is just another attack on public education. And we get into this, right? Public education is under attack and has been under attack for decades in this country. It's a way to discredit public school employees and public schools as a whole by trying to pit parents and families and community members against the school system by saying we're teaching kids to feel bad that they're white. We're pitting different cultural groups against one another. It's a way to turn families and communities against public schools because the right-wing agenda is to get rid of public education. They want to privatize it. And by turning students and their families and their communities against public schools, it makes it that much easier to direct them right into private schools, charter schools, creating a school voucher system. And that's the plan, because that's where there's money for corporations and the politicians that are then going to get funded by those education corporations. And that's kind of the take that NJ21 has on this. We need to do something. This is not going to go away. And again, as Leah mentioned, the governor's election in Virginia is just a sign of things to come in the 2022 midterm elections. Right-wing politicians are going to use critical race theory as a way to bring out votes of families who are concerned about what is being taught in schools, and they're going to use it as a way to take over, take control, take power, win their elections. So it's not just an education issue. It never was, but it definitely isn't now. It becomes much more, reaching for every aspect of our lives. So what do we do about this? I'm going to scroll through some of this toolkit because it starts off with frequently asked questions, and most of this Leah did a much better job explaining, and that PowerPoint was a lot better. But the part that I think is super important for everyone on this call and everyone who works in public education is this messaging guidance. We know that teachers especially are going to be having more and more of these conversations. They're going to be confronted by parents, family members, community members, sometimes even students and colleagues who don't understand what CRT is and are still upset that it's being taught in schools. So we have different scenarios here, talking to a colleague, talking to a family or a community member, but I'm going to scroll down here because things that are really important in all of these conversations, when somebody comes to you and says, hey, I don't like critical race theory. I just don't think that it's right. I don't think we should be teaching kids to be ashamed of who they are, or I don't think we should be pitting different groups against one another. The biggest thing to keep in mind is that we can't shy away from critical race theory. A lot of people's first reactions is to try and defend and justify and say, well, nobody's actually teaching critical race theory in school. It's a graduate level theory. And we know that at its core, that is true. But the right wing isn't out there explaining what critical race theory is. They're not out there giving, graduate level seminars on critical race theory. They're out there saying that we're talking about race in schools. And that should be true. As educators, we should be acknowledging race and racism and structural and systemic oppression, and we can't shy away from that. So we have to name it. We have to say what we're doing, and what we're doing is teaching the truth, keeping honesty in education, and providing a safe space for our students to use their critical thinking skills to analyze the world around them. And that's good education. That's good teaching. So if we don't shy away from it, the next step then is to start to find those shared values with whoever it is that you're having that conversation with. Family members, community members, students, they all want what's best for students and children. We might disagree with what that looks like, but everyone wants students to be successful, especially teachers, right? That's why we're in this field. Everyone who works in public education, we want what's best for students, and we need to start there. And as educators, we need to be explaining why providing honesty and truth in our teaching is what's best for students. So the best way to do all of this is by having these one-on-one conversations, because ultimately this is going to come down to organizing. We need to step out of our classrooms or step out of our school buildings and start to organize our colleagues and the communities that we work in. The right does a great job of that. They are very organized and they're very well funded, and we need to step up and we need to do it better than them. So anyone that has any organizing experience knows the best way to organize is by having these one-on-one conversations. And that's where these messaging guidance tips come in, because when a colleague comes to you and says, CRT teaches students that all white people are racist, and I just don't agree with that, that's a great chance to have that one-on-one conversation. Find your shared values with your colleague. You're obviously both in the same field. You both agree that students need to learn critical thinking. They need to be prepared for that outside world. And that means that they need to be taught the truth in their classes. And that truth isn't always comfortable for us to teach, especially in a field like education that is predominantly upper middle class white women. And we need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable in a classroom. And then turn it into more of that organizing conversation. Find out, what are they hearing? Why are they upset? And what would it look like in an ideal school for them? And that's a really great segue for students and families and community members as well. What do they want to see in their school district? And what does it take to have that? Because ultimately it takes fully funding public education to get more counselors, more nurses, more art programs, more band classes, better resources, more teachers, smaller class sizes. All of that takes fully funding public education. And that's where you get them. You pull them back in and say, yeah, well, did you know that these candidates don't want to fully fund public education? Like at its root, that's the issue, that they're trying to dismantle our public schools. So I don't know. I mean, hopefully then with that organizing, we're starting to pull people in. Ultimately, there's a lot of groups doing similar work. I definitely want to name Police Free Schools. I know I said earlier that we're a member of that coalition, and they are doing so many great meetings and trainings for students around the state in New Jersey. And one of the activities that they have students do is talk about, what does your perfect school look like? And they do it virtually. You could easily do it in person, and students are coming up with what they want to see in their perfect schools. And then they start to talk about what the police budget looks like in their schools. And what if we shifted some of that money to hiring another art teacher or hiring more counselors, more nurses? And ultimately, this is the same kind of thing. We all want better public schools. And if we start with those shared values with the families or colleagues who are concerned about CRT, we just need to explicitly name that this is a right-wing attack on public education. They're coming after all of us, not just the people who believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then I'm going to just end it with this. I know Leah said also that the right wing's just so good. They've got these like template letters, and they tell people how to run for board office, and they just kind of hand everything that you need out on a silver platter. And we're not quite there yet about, running board members, maybe one day, but we do have letter to the editor templates in here that could come from family members, school employees. We had, and then this is something I think is very important too. It's a template letter to thank supportive school boards. I think that is a part that we often leave out. There are a lot of school districts in New Jersey right now that are having issues with parents at board meetings screaming aggressively about critical race theory and diversity, equity, and inclusion in schools. And there are school boards that are backing up their teachers, and they need to hear from people as well, that we are thankful for that. It cannot just be upset, angry parents at school board meetings. We have to be there supporting as well. So if anybody is interested in this template, you do need to email NJ21 United. I can drop our email address in the chat for you. Right now, it's only been released to NJ21 caucus members, and then we're just emailing it out on an individual basis. But if you guys just email us, let you know that you were here, we'll send it out to you. And that's it from me. So I'm going to throw it back over to Ellen now.
Okay, thank you so much, Kristen. That was great. Okay, so now our last speaker tonight is Manny Martinez, who's a Newark Public Schools history teacher and also a member of the Newark Education Caucus. So Manny.
Awesome. Thank you, Ellen. That's a lot to follow. Um, I just yeah, I've been teaching for 2 or 3. This is my 3rd year technically, and I've learned a lot about the schools, especially in Newark. But I guess I want to add some information that to add on to what Leah and Kristen said. And I just want to give a little bit of historical context of the 20th century leading up to the development of critical race theory in terms of how working class people around the world were theorizing about racism and acting. And I could go much further, but I want to focus on the interwar period between World War I and World War II. At that time, Black workers in Chicago courageously organized Italian workers to attack the interior Italian capitalists from bombing Ethiopia, because they wanted to be able to enter that territory to expand their terrain of profits, as other European countries were doing in the African continent. Around the same time, under the courageous leadership of the Black mothers of 9 boys in Scottsboro, Alabama, workers in Mexico, in Haiti, in Germany, in many cities in the US and other parts of the world, risked their lives and organized in different parts of the world in order to defend these boys against false accusation of rape against 2 white women, and were able to prevent their lynching. In South Africa, the unity of white and Black workers was able to go head to head frontally against the bosses that owned the gold mines, which was one of the main sources of profit for bosses in that part of the world. And there are many other examples around the world, but this is just an example of the action that workers around the world were taking based on a theoretical advance that the international working class had achieved, based on an experience of struggle since the inception of capitalism in the world. And that theoretical understanding was that racism, along with sexism, is central. Fighting racism and sexism is central to smashing capitalism. And at the same time, that capitalism cannot be challenged without weakening bosses' ability to generate super profits from paying workers of darker skin less, and from the difference of what is paid to workers of white skin versus workers of darker skin. So then how did bosses respond to this around the world? And it's tied to the essence of critical race theory. Bosses used the law in terror. In this, coming out of this period, you had Japanese imperialists using racism in order to win Japanese workers to kill workers in Indochina. You had the bosses in Germany convincing non-Jews to kill Jews. You had bosses in the US convincing workers of white skin to viciously kill Black workers in the South. You had the bosses in the Dominican Republic convincing lighter skinned Dominicans to kill Black Haitians. Fascism was on the rise around the world. That was their response to workers fighting racism together. And the other aspect of it is that while some, I will use the word fascist, bosses use that, others chose to use the law in order to convince workers in the US to keep the worldwide system of capitalism that needs racism. What was it? And I'm just going off of the top of my head, so I don't remember the specific details, but some of the greatest reform was made coming out of World War II. More housing, more education, for the veterans coming back, all of those things. And that was to hold workers back from getting more engaged in this fight that workers were having all over the world. And they also used the law in order to get rid of these more class conscious workers, both black and white. If you were a white worker coming out of World War II involved in these type of politics that were attacking bosses and tying it to racism, you were probably fired. If you were a black worker, you were murdered. So even that difference in the response. So coming into the 1970s, when the critical race theory is developed by students in law schools, they are inheriting all of these workers that have been disappeared and that made those theoretical advances about our understanding of racism and how to smash it. And I think with that, I just want to say my very inadequate understanding of critical race theory. You know, I was given the opportunity. I'm here. You know what I did? What any regular person would do. I went and looked at some podcasts. I got a book to prepare. And I just wanted to get a general feeling and sense of the types of words that were being used in the podcast and the book. And I just want to express I think some strengths and weaknesses in trying to be objective. And what do we do with that? I think something to in terms of the strengths, and I'll borrow from what Leah said, is that law is not neutral. That is such an important concept for us to struggle around, no matter what country we live in. That law is not neutral, and trying to understand how the state is used in order to control us and divide us and divide working class people would sustain all of these political states. So that is really important, and a lot of the work that these scholars are doing is to try to depict and list all of these historical examples of pointing to this law and that law and seeing the difference in how we experience our lives based on our racial background. And that's really powerful and useful information in helping workers understand how racist divisions are maintained. I think that the other useful thing for me is really thinking about the policies and practices that are constructed onto the law and how they're used in order to maintain the racial inequalities. And I think just one example of that is I learned that a few years ago. I think maybe it's part of this era of what do you call it, the civil rights, that there was a law that was made for schools who were in avid districts or in districts where there's more poverty, that there couldn't be more than 24 students in the classroom. And it wasn't in writing, but somehow I guess it got out under the last superintendent in Newark that somehow he had overwritten that law. So we have schools like my own, which the teachers are teaching classes with 30, 40 students. And it's in a school, in a community where all of our students are Black and Latino. So, so it's useful using this theory. I think in terms of the weaknesses, I think that when I heard these podcasts and I was looking at this book, none of the podcasts mentioned the word capitalism. And the book only mentioned the word capitalism once. And I think that at a certain level, and it replaces it with white supremacy. If we go back to these examples, these historical examples of how workers fought racism that I mentioned at the beginning, it leaves us, what's the word? it weakens our ability to fight racism if we don't connect it, if we don't understand its place within the capitalist system in which we live in. It disarms, that's the word. Sorry, I was looking for the word. It disarms both Black and white workers, all workers. And I think that going from that, I just want to share some thoughts about this disagreement between what we see as Republicans and Democrats over this issue of the critical race theory. Why is it that Republicans are attacking a critical race theory? And why is it that someone like AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and Kamala Harris are going on in Twitter or in that state up in the north and supporting it, vocally? I forget the state, New Hampshire, there you go. And I think it speaks to the disagreement that this split in the ruling class in this country has over how they're going to control the source of their wealth, all of us as working class people. I think that as my co-speakers have shared at some level, when people attack critical race theory, they don't really know what it is. But what I see from the rhetoric of the Republicans and putting it within the context of where we are at this moment in history is that the Republicans closer to Trump are more interested in just maintaining a smaller white base of workers, including in the military. They're not as interested in what's going on internationally. And with that, they have to respond to all of these white workers who went out on the streets alongside non-white workers when the George Floyd rebellions happened all over the country. And they have to find a way of winning some of those workers back. So it's this superficial attempt at raising the racism as an idea inside of the head of these workers. And we're a little defenseless when we talk primarily about white supremacy without helping white workers understand who shaped that idea and how it's used by the ruling class. Or in relationship to that, I think what I see with the Democratic Party is that for them it's different. At this moment in history, they are seeing that they have a huge challenge with another superpower that is growing in China. And during the pandemic, China was able to build, hundreds, if not thousands of submarines with weapons. In comparison, the US was only able to build like a dozen, very few. So they have to face up that prospect. And the world was able to see how the ruling class in this country is in disarray. And they weren't able to give leadership to the world with the pandemic or with the vaccines. So now they can't afford to be as racist, openly racist as the Republicans, even though their policies end up having us in the same racist conditions. They have to do certain rhetoric and verbiage in order to, at some level, win some of us over to their possible war plans for the future. Some of these kids in my school are gonna be, we have military recruiters in my school, and some of these kids are the kids that they're gonna use as cannon fodder for their war in this rising war. So then what do we do with this? And I'll close with that. What do we do with this? I think that the response for me is not necessary. It's not electoral politics. I think for me, it doesn't matter who's in office, because we've had Murphy in office, and under his leadership, so many undocumented workers were murdered in the detention centers. So many, I never saw in my lifetime undocumented workers being willing to risk their lives, going on hunger strike and organizing in the detention centers the way that they did during the pandemic. Because usually undocumented workers are more vulnerable to pandering to the Democratic Party, because if we are sharper and we fight back at a greater level, we get deported. So I think with that, I just want to share some small things about what we can do. I think we should take a serious look at these different books and sources that talk about critical race theory, and think about how we can transform it into action, and find situations where no matter what our background is, workers and working class youth, students are coming together to attack these racist divisions. And I just want to share these 3 different examples. In Newark in particular, there were 4 brothers that were harassed by the police in their neighborhood. They were racially profiled. And immediately after the incident happened, there was a news article where it said that a gang attacked the police in order to cover up what they did. And the mayor, a liberal Democrat, tried to cover up as well. Now there's a fight that is being built by workers that are locally in Newark and are trying to expose how Democrats, these liberals, are even more dangerous, because under their leadership, they use all of this anti-racist rhetoric, but they still maintain these policies that they need to maintain their system. So there's going to be a court date for them on Thursday to support because one of the brothers is still in jail under the pretense that he assaulted a police officer, when what really happened was that 2 brothers came to defend the 2 other initial brothers. And if they hadn't defended them, the police officers might have injured them, if not killed them. So that's one struggle. The other struggle that I just want to make everyone aware of is that since the last spring, workers in coal mine in Bessemer, Alabama have been on strike. 45% of these workers are Black workers. And they are showing an unprecedented level of multiracial unity. How the state is responding to them is that scabs who are associated with the KKK in that part of the country, the courts, by way of making legal moves that support the mining bosses and the state troopers, are beginning at this point, or have already begun, to make the situation more violent for these workers. Workers have been ran over by scabs on their trucks. Guns are out on both sides, and they don't see an end to this strike anytime soon. They need support. There's going to be a fundraiser for a toy drive for all of these families. And there's an event that's going to happen, a virtual event as well, next week, where these miners from there, miners from Colombia, I think miners from Mexico, and miners from maybe the Congo in Africa are going to talk about their struggles to bring international perspective to this question. So I just want to leave it there, and thank you so much for listening to my words, and thank you, Ellen, for inviting me.
Okay, thank you so much, Manny. I think we went full range of ideas here, and a lot of very good information. So what I want to do now is open up the floor for discussion. I want to remind you, at the bottom of your screen, there's a place that says reactions, and you should be able to raise your hand there, and I can call on you. Try to keep your comments to just several minutes, and we'll let from time to time, our speakers will respond to some of your comments, but you can ask questions or whatever. Okay, so I'll open it up now. Anybody have comments, ideas? I know there's some things that have been going on in the chat on different questions, but it would be good if any of those things, if you want to just speak to them on the floor here, that would be helpful. Okay, Dan has a comment. Go
Hi,
ahead,
how's it
Dan.
going? Hi, I'm a public school educator in Monmouth County. I'm also a member of NJ21 United. I'm just wondering because I haven't been following kind of the national situation with critical race theory, if there's been any kind of coordination between the major teachers unions to fight back against this. I'm not sure if anybody, is aware of that, if NEA or the AFT is kind of working on protecting Black students as it relates to this issue.
So I am a member of AFT through higher ed. So I get those sort of updates from Randy Weingarten. But there is nothing in particular that I've seen or that I'm aware of in terms of really pushing back. I know the AFT and I imagine the NEA as well tends to align themselves with organizations like Learning for Justice and Zen Education Project when it works for them, right? Kind of maybe this other idea of interest convergence. So I know that there's some involvement there, but concerted effort, I'm not really aware of or am privy to. So it's a question that I have and I've been looking into, and I haven't seen much yet. I saw Kristen come on, Mike.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, NEA, I think, recognizes that it is a problem and will be a problem in the midterm elections, especially after that Virginia race. But I do just want to say, I love that Manny tied this back to the idea of capitalism, because that is at the root the biggest issue. And while having a union is obviously fantastic, I always like to remind people that NEA and AFT are billion-dollar corporations. They're unions, but they're also billion-dollar corporations. So anything that we need, that we want done, is going to have to come from the grassroots level. And that's why it's so important to see this as a time to organize and to band together, because this is such an intersectional issue, not just education, but for every aspect of society.
Okay, I see Kathy has your hand up. Go ahead, Kathy Scarborough. You got to unmute though.
Yeah, okay, I'm here. Yes, I was wondering, I read in our newspaper locally that there were some parents in Wayne, but I was wondering if you've heard of any other kerfuffles at various school boards around the state, because I don't know how I would hear if there was something going on in my school board. It's not a website I check on regularly or anything like that. But I'd like to know. And I'd like to know how invaded we are by this organized effort on the part of the right. Anybody hear of any other?
Anybody know?
Any other school boards?
I'll jump in. Oh, sorry, Manny, go.
Well, I would be interested in hearing from people in general, from wherever y'all are. I assume most people here are in Jersey, right? Yes, because it's central Jersey. Yeah, Or I would also be interested in hearing if you are using critical race theory in your schools in any capacity, or if people are talking about it in your school.
Okay. Not to, Kristen, you can go back to it, but Jessica has her hand raised, so go ahead, Jessica.
I was just going to say that, and I'll drop in the chat, but and I mentioned it earlier, but I think it's North Hunterdon Regional High School has had parents come to a school board. So Kathy, to answer your question, I think some are making the news, but some are just, you have to be at the board meeting to hear some of the things that are being said. So in this particular case, they were calling for books to be banned, specifically books that reflect the stories of LGBTQ people and young people. And then the students organized and actually came back and had a whole website. And so I'll drop both of those in the chat. But then I also think in many school districts, it might just be one person that's coming or a couple people. I've heard, I live in Highland Park, and I know there's been one person who says things every once in a while, but I think it can be things like that. But the ones that are big are often in the news.
Also to Manny's question, is anybody who's working in a school district? Is there discussion going on about CRT? Are people doing stuff in their classrooms or?
So did you notice that Josh said that 2 anti-CRT parents were just elected to their school board, but the question was, which school board is that?
Right, and he said Central Regional, which I'm not honestly sure I know where Central Regional is. Maybe you could clarify that, Josh? Oh, it's in Hunterdon or no? That's part of Hunterdon? Okay, Linda, you wanted to speak? I don't know if Josh or anybody wanted to answer that question a little bit more.
I don't know if this speaks directly to that question, but
Ocean County.
one of the people who's actually been a school board member, because I don't know how she exactly got elected, but in some of the debates, she was also running again for school board, and the whole thing about racism came up, and she was telling stories that did not go over too well about she was invited to the Democratic Club, and I mean all the candidates who were running were invited to present their positions, and she was telling the story about how this mother was so upset because her child came home and was crying because he was saying, "Oh, mommy, I can't play with my black friends anymore because I'm white." And then when right before the election, what she did was she refused to put a mask on at a school board meeting, being one of the school board members, and ended up being arrested. And I think that was a publicity stunt. At the second debate that was held, she really kind of tried to hide who she was and, what she was there. I mean, she was at January 6th at the Capitol building and called it basically a prayer vigil where she was doing her rosaries, a peaceful prayer vigil or something along those lines. And, she was within 50 feet of the Capitol and didn't see any type of violence. But on the other side, I have a friend, who's very progressive, considers herself very progressive, and she's the head of the Women's Club. And I asked her to announce tonight's meeting. And she said to me, well, I don't know how many people are going to be interested in that. And from the looks of the people there, I went as a guest. I thought it was because most of them look like they were grandparents' age and there might not be too many parents, so they weren't really involved in school issues. But the way she announced it was, in case anyone was interested, there'd be discussion on critical race theory, a Zoom meeting. But don't worry, because we're not teaching it in Franklin, and CRT, the school board's at it, and it's not going to be done. And I know for sure that it's not being taught. And it was just like, well, exactly the type of things that have been talked about tonight, that people don't really understand what it is. And the fact that she presented it that way showed that she didn't really understand, or that she was just trying to make sure that people who were in the meeting, which she would know more than I would, where their heads were at, it was something to be afraid of rather than something to be understood, which of course was against the whole idea of having this discussion. So obviously none of those people attended this Zoom, but that's the kind of things that I've just run into.
Let's see, other comments? Question? Trying to see, please shout out if I'm missing you.
I think Betty wanted to.
Betty? Where's Betty? Go for it. Oh, there you are, Betty. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm a retired guidance counselor out of Newark, New Jersey, and part of the New Caucus, plus a socialist feminist. And one of the things that is very disturbing about this is that I think that I'm glad the two caucuses are addressing this issue, but there needs to be more of a united front around solving this problem or attacking this problem. I think, I just remembered, being in in one school. I was there for 21 years. I really didn't interact with too many other teachers, mainly just the guidance counselors when we came together. So a lot of times teaching can be an isolating experience in terms of being in one school. And I think there needs to be a way where we come together to support each other. And especially during COVID, it's been more isolating. And I know there's a tremendous amount of burden on teachers now because of COVID, because of the working conditions, because of the type of mandates that are coming down. But I think if we don't unite more on this issue, we have to teach the next generation of students about real history, about what this country has done to people. And if we don't do it, they won't have the strength or the courage to fight back. And that may be the legacy that teachers have to leave for these kids, is to give them the information so they have that chance to fight back when they, and many of them are doing it at the high school level. But, we need to do something in terms of coming together. I'm so glad this forum was happening and people were able to come together, but what would be our next step in terms of continuing the fight?
I didn't know if Manny, you were about to talk or.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I wrote some. I was just responding to Betty. I was talking about all of these ideas in the world, but in my school, just to share with everybody, we're missing counselors, we're missing social workers, we're missing cafeteria workers, we're missing aides, we're missing teachers, and it creates a really explosive situation where so many of us have to do, those of us who are in the building have to do much more in every single department. And the direct result is our students are attacked more. Like, why are you not finishing your work? Like, why are you skipping class? Why are you fighting outside of the school? And it's a direct a direct response to the neglect that they're having. What I see last year, directly after those George Floyd protests, there was an energy in my school to start a social justice committee, and we started doing these advisories every week, which under the pandemic it was easier because it was virtual, and we finished our work duties during the day, and then we sat together for an hour or two, sometimes three, and we struggled over the ideas that we wanted to present in that weekly advisory. And in those advisories, every person in the school was having the same conversation, and we were able to talk about the history of racism, different topics, not just racism, and it was really great. And one of the things that came out of that, we did a survey about the conditions in the building and how the workers felt, and one piece of data that stood out to me was that at least 1/3 of the people in the building had only been working at the school for 3 years or less, which means that most of the people there don't have tenure. And that helped me understand a lot about why, when I would reach out to a coworker and they would tell me, like, you gotta be careful. Like, you gotta be careful when you criticize a principal. You gotta be careful when, like, basically they're smart, my coworkers, and they're scared at the same time because they're afraid of the retaliation. So I think knowing that, what I'm doing this year is just continuing to have conversations with my coworkers, continuing to be involved with New Caucus and seeing the experiences of teachers and education workers in other parts of the district in Newark, and building up the kind of like the consciousness of the people around me so that they can see that it's necessary to fight back, that it's natural that we're going to get attacked for embarrassing Ras Baraka in our city, that he's allowing these things to happen, and that we can learn from our weaknesses and how we get attacked and do it better each time. And really not only teach our students and everyone around us about, like Betty said, the history of all of these racist attacks, but also teach them the history of how we fought back, how white workers haven't only been won over to maintain racism, but white workers and Black workers and Asian Latin workers we have a history of fighting racism together. And that's just as important, if not more important, to teach our children and each other. Because then that little boy, I don't know who was talking, is not gonna have the thought of, I can't, because I'm white, I can't hang out with my Black friends. He might have the thought of, oh shit, like, we gotta strengthen our friendship. And we both gotta work on whatever happens to either of us. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Nathan, did you want to speak?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate what Manny was saying about, I think, like, the idea of teaching better the struggles, the history of our struggles, and how deconstructing race is what it's all about rather than perpetuating it. But there was something that was said earlier and I appreciate all three presentations so much. And there was something that was said earlier by Kristen about shared values, and one of those being that we want all our kids to be successful. And some of what I've read about, like, takes on white supremacy is that, like, that idea of what success is a big part of the problem. It's kind of what white supremacy says is success, and that culture that is permeated in our institutions. So like how much hope do you see, or how much opportunity do you see in that conversation, or in that kind of organizing in the schools to maybe adjust that whole concept of what success means in terms of this competitive nature of our society, rather than success in terms of cooperation and cultural, besides things just like culture, but a whole shift in how we see success and teach success.
Ooh, that's a great question, Nathan. I think in the terms of organizing and having that organizing conversation, it's okay to leave the definition of success kind of vague and undefined, because everyone does have a different idea. I think what's more important is when you're starting that conversation to lead with those shared values, especially, like, as a public school educator, I support public education, and hopefully, my colleagues do, the families I work with do, the community I work in does as well. So just, our shared value could be supporting public education, but then your question gets into like what could be like a much lengthier conversation and discussion about how we just need to radically change the structure of education to begin with, because so much of success is defined by standardized tests and this idea of just, like what is a good student? What does it look like? And rooted in that idea of white supremacy is very often a kid that can sit at a desk silently and finish a worksheet. That's what schools looked like for decades. So we need to challenge the idea of success in education separately from this challenge of confronting critical race theory and just like critical thinking in schools. I think it's kind of like a two-prong approach. But I'd love to hear from the other panelist members and everyone else on here what they think as well.
Do any other panelists want to address it, or anyone else?
Well, just
that particular
I guess,
question?
Yeah, I guess just real quick, just from the few folks who have just spoken, there were just thoughts percolating, and so like to Nathan's point, what he was saying of the shift in culture, and connected to Kristen, the shift in economics as well, right? So it's not just focusing on, getting rid of, smashing, as Manny would say, capitalism, so that we're actually looking at some sort of system of cooperative economics, right? So we're about to be in 2022. There is no reason at this point in time that we should have such gaps in terms of wealth. We have too many resources on this earth, which, side note, we certainly need to get into more ways to be sustainable as well. That needs to continue to be emphasized. But there's too many resources on this earth at this point in time that we should still have people living in poverty, still have people starving, I shouldn't still be seeing these commercials of children in underdeveloped countries with flies around their face. Like, this is what I saw when I was growing up, right? I'm no young whippersnapper, so it's been a while. So there's no reason at this point in time. And I think with COVID and the pandemic right now in Newark, I work with student teachers, so I'm in some of the buildings in the public school district. And by now, at least in some of the classes, all of the students have Chromebooks. This is not something that was occurring prior to the pandemic. And having had experience working with student teachers in suburban districts, that was already the norm. So when the pandemic hit, switching to a virtual learning environment was almost seamless, right? Except for the fact that everyone was in a panic because we weren't sure what was going on. So certainly there were still those same sort of issues in terms of social and emotional. But for resources, it was like, okay, now I'm at home with my Google Doc. I know how to share a doc. I know how to do comments and highlight and so on and so forth. And that wasn't the norm in places like Newark. And now it is. And it just showed us that all of a sudden these resources could, quote unquote, appear out of thin air. We have everything that we need. right? So why do we continue to this system continue to persist? And just, I guess, kind of like the last thought and thinking about again what folks, the few folks before have said, it's just this anti-intellectualism just is running so rampant. Being afraid of an idea that you don't truly understand. Again, why are we still at this point? Why don't we have an educational system where this is embraced and encouraged, that we learn different ideas and learn how to think about them critically, as opposed to just getting these little news snippets and running with that, right, with the rhetoric. So I'll stop there.
Okay, Paul, you wanted to speak?
Yeah, I was interested when Kristen brought up that she taught at a social justice school, and I haven't been following educational trends in New Jersey or nationally. I've heard of STEM schools. My nephew in Maine went to a STEM school, but I never heard of a social justice school. And by the way, many years ago when I lived in Chicago, I was a teacher and I taught mathematics and science to elementary grades, and also working with teachers to get them more comfortable with that. And I heard about the algebra project, which I don't know if that Bob Moses, and if that relates to social justice. It sounds like it does, but I never got into it in any depth. I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so the program I work in is fairly new. We actually opened our doors September 2019, so we haven't yet had a full school year in person as the School of Social Justice. So hopefully knock on wood this year, but it's an academy within the public high school I work at. I teach in Long Branch in Monmouth County, like right next to Monmouth University. So our public high school is grades 9 through 12. It's just maybe a little over 1,500 kids. And 3 years ago, to kind of solve a number of issues, we reopened the historic high school that's like right next door to our nice new high school, and turned it into a school of social justice. It's open to 11th and 12th grade students in our building. They have to choose to go there, but it's not really like an application process. They just make the switch over. And our focus is on really implementing cross-curricular lessons. So as a math teacher, I team up with English and science and electives a lot to kind of like teach similar lessons that go together. And then also on teaching social justice through a math lens. As far as my research has shown, I believe there's maybe one other program in New Jersey. I think the Maplewood South Orange District might also have a social justice program of some sort. And I know obviously they do the Map So Freedom School as well. And then across the country, major cities tend to have social justice programs, but it hasn't been something that's really taken off. So I'm hopeful. I think every school should just like teach through a social justice lens, but I think having dedicated programs at least makes it easier to lay that groundwork and start to build curriculums that focus on that. But yeah, I could talk about my social justice program forever, so I'll stop there, but I hope that answered your question.
Other comments, questions?
And so in terms of the algebra project, I mean, certainly if folks didn't already, they can Google it. But the short of it is Bob Moses, has done a lot of things. He just passed this summer, but he was a member and staffer of SNCC, and he was a key person in coordinating the Freedom Summer Project down in Mississippi, which led to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and running and being a part of the larger national democratic system to try to get on the ballot. So he, from that experience and being a part of the civil rights movement, he's a mathematician as well. And so he recognized in the 80s that, particularly with his own children, that algebra was basically a gatekeeper when it comes to mathematics. And so he found that as a civil rights issue, that children, particularly Black children, needed to be taught algebra so that they would be able to be successful. And so part of the ways that he did that, and the way that the Algebra Project works, is that it is definitely a culturally relevant curriculum, and that the students are centered in their own communities and look at things like the transportation system in their community, right? And how do you get from one place to another, and doing all that lovely math. I don't know if my co-director, Brandy Wade, is finished dusting her living room. I just called her out. But she might have some other things to add in the chat, or I don't know if she wants to come on mic if she's familiar with that and wants to talk about that. But just wanted to give a little background for folks who may not be familiar with the Algebra Project.
Okay, Brandy seems to think you did a good summary. So I know that there is some controversy now too, though, within debate in math, I guess, that I see cited frequently in articles that are criticizing critical race theory, referring to what's going on in California around math programs, and seem to be taking the approach that algebra was being taught too early, things like that. I don't know that it has anything to do with CRT, that particular debate or discussion, actually, but anyway, maybe someone who's in the math field can comment on sort of the debate that's CRT related in math. But I wanted to just make a couple other comments. One is that I think we have to be very clear that I know regularly in the press, I read the Wall Street Journal regularly. It's like 2 or 3 days a week, there's an article on this. And it's always central to it is that the unions are the problem here. This is one of the biggest targets, is that teachers' unions need to be wiped out from their perspective. Even probably there's the public school aspect too, but the unions are very key. And I think it's important that unions start to think about this and take it up, or how they want to address it. And then I did want to ask a question, I guess maybe of Leah, since you kind of presented the first section on CRT. I know Manny kind of presented some ideas on perspectives around how to fight for change and social change around the question of racism. And I think, but I'm not really clear what's people who are supportive of critical race theory. There's all kinds of strands about analysis about race and racism. CRT is one of them. And then whether there's any kind of general ideas about how people who are today, not necessarily in the 80s, but today, talking about critical race theory, how they think about how to fight against racism, or whether that's not really part of it, if it's disconnected from that. So that's a little unclear to me, so.
Hello, my name is Dave Schrager.
Dave,
May I say a couple things?
Well, let's see if anybody wants to respond to the question first, and then I can call on you.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So, I mean, some of my first thoughts, I feel, have been shared in the panel, and some folks probably on the comments as well, if I'm remembering correctly. But I do want to emphasize, when Kristen was showing NJ21 United's toolkit, that idea of starting with shared values first, and also emphasize a point that Manny made in the chat and then spoke to afterwards about the current working conditions and being overworked, and not being able to make true connections, and this continued isolation for teachers. So with that context, my suggestions around that has to do with building strong relationships with students and families in particular. I know that it's very important as workers that we're making those connections and building those relationships with each other, again, around our working conditions, but we have to see students, and honestly, really, no matter what age. I know we tend to think about high school first because they're a little older, a little more independent, but we can talk about these ideas with younger students as well. I have a little workbook that's out of reach right now, but it's about the principles of Black Lives Matter. And it's basically a coloring book, but each page has an image. It gives a little history about the person or people in the image, and then in the principle and the definition of the principle. And usually there's some space for the students to write about, the young person to write about what that principle means to them. Just one of my student teachers that I observed yesterday, I was at Behringer, Manny, I didn't see you, had a lesson about empathy. And just actually ask the students, what does that mean to them, to share a story. They were doing some kind of collaborative discussion and writing. But the point being that we need to develop the relationships with the students, and also thinking about how, I think Kristen brought up the point that we need to rethink the educational system itself, which I wholeheartedly agree with. Standardized testing cannot be at the center. So how do we talk again with students and families about the real purposes behind standardized testing, how they feel about standardized testing, and actually organize, whether it's opt-out, which I know was big, particularly with Save Our Schools, New Jersey, but other organizations as well. Like, do we need to go back to that? I think having, again, the context of the pandemic could probably make that very easy. The tests were waived the past April, or past spring rather, because it's testing for months. We need to be thinking now about getting them waived again. I know in Newark, I'm sure in other places, October was testing definitely every week and almost every day. There was PSAT, there's the state testing about Start Strong to see where students are after being out of buildings for almost 2 years. Like, there's so many issues. And really, whatever issue is most pressing in your school or your district is the one that folks need to organize around. But you can't know that until you actually talk to people. And I just want to end with talking with students. Connecting with families is just as important as connecting with your fellow workers.
Okay. Manny,
Also-
you wanted to add something? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I appreciate the clarifying question. Just looking back at my comments, I think, I did the best that I could, but I did want to make this point that if anyone is attracted to critical race theory at this moment in history, it's a positive thing. And it's potential for us, because especially after something like George Floyd, a lot of more in the pandemic, how a lot of us around the world were abandoned by the system, people are looking for answers. And for working class people and youth to be attracted at any level to fight racism, it's great. It's really great. On the other side of it is that we really are trained to look at things in a fragmentary way, in a superficial way. And it has to do a lot with how our lives are organized, that how many more people could benefit from being part of this this coffee table talk. So many more people, but people are so tired. People are disaffected. People are under a deep level of depression. So many people. And the fragments of our understanding, whether for or against critical race theory, like so many other things, comes from the memes that we see on social media, or just the title of the article from New York Times or Washington Post. We don't even click on the articles. We just make formulate opinions based on those headlines.
Right.
And we really have a very profound heritage of those before us, generations past, that some of these young people in the 70s, and we're taking it now 4 or 5 decades later, and try to use whatever we could find. This is what we found in terms of how to fighting racism. What can we do to it, and how can we sharpen it? How can we always sharpen it and make it more powerful? And just the last point I want to make about what you said about the unions, I think it's really important to reinforce that point, that historically the role of unions has ultimately been to negotiate the level of exploitation under which we are in. That is their role. From the most progressive unions to the most disgusting unions, like the most anti-worker unions, all of them, all the spectrum, that is their role, to negotiate the level of our exploitation at our workplace. So then what do we do with that? And how do we use them and push them to the limit? And when we get to that limit, what do we do? And definitely the one in Newark Teachers Union is a disaster. Yeah, I hope that clarifies a little bit my thoughts.
Well,
Okay, David, you wanted to
yes,
speak?
I have a couple. Well, I think one of the biggest problems is the distortions about what critical race theory actually is. It's a study of the history of racism in this country, in addition to being critical race theory says about race what anthropologists say about race, that race is actually a social construct. It's not a biological thing, that we are all of the human race. And it also says that it's done in a way, though, that race in the United States has been constructed in a way that is destructive towards people who are not white, particularly to Black people. If I could just say very quickly about public sector unions, why teachers unions are being attacked. I am a retired state worker, and I was active in my union, CWA, since 1981. And there has been a push to destroy unions in this country since unions were created. And the only sector where unions are growing is the public sector. So the way you finish destroying the public, the union movement, is to go after the public sector unions, which is where unions are growing. It's the only area where the union movement is still growing. There was a movie years ago, Waiting for Superman. It was it posed as if it were a what do you call it? Type of movie that Michael Moore makes. I'm trying, and the word escapes me.
Documentary?
Documentary, but it wasn't. It was a highly sophisticated propaganda movie to attack the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, and Randy Weingarten. Now, whatever you think about Randy Weingarten or the AFT, they're the second largest teachers union and it was also used to promote Michelle Rhee, who was trying to introduce merit pay, which is something that unions have always opposed because it's divisive. History shows that merit pay will tend to go to white males and not to women and not to people of color. So this is a very sophisticated piece of propaganda. So when you see public teachers unions, the NEA and the AFT under attack, or any other public sector union, the reason is they're not finished trying to destroy the labor movement in this country. So I think that's something that we need to be aware of. We need to defend unions. We need to defend bosses again. Workers against in their struggles against the bosses as progressives. We support the working class, and as imperfect as unions may be, they are the representatives of the working class. So, but anyway,
Yeah, you need to wrap up, David, so.
Yes, I'm sorry.
That's probably a good place to stop.
I wanted to say, and I did want to apologize for arriving late. I was in Morris County, so I apologize for arriving
No
late.
problem.
Thank you for.
Okay, were there any last comments or questions from anyone before we go? Okay, let me just give all of our speakers a chance to make any last comments you want to make. This has been a really wonderful, fascinating discussion tonight, and you all have presented so much rich things to be thinking about. So I know I just want to tell everybody, don't worry, we recorded this. We'll have the recording available for people, and I guess people could also write noendlesswar@gmail.com, and maybe somehow we can get together the slideshows, or at least Leah's slideshow, to make it available if you weren't able to get it off the chat, because that was some really good information. And then you all can ask Kristen directly for things about NJ21. Any comments to wrap up from any of your speakers you'd like to say?
Yeah, well, first I'd like to say thank you. Thank you. And I'll say for having all of us, just in the sense of, I just thought that all three kind of presentations just really went so well together, right? We all kind of connected, but also talked more expansively about different areas and topics. So I thought that was amazing. So thank you to Ellen and Mark's Place Coffee House for pulling this conversation together. I think, this is the work, right? We talk about, well, I know I talk a lot about direct actions, which are certainly important, protesting, having one-to-ones, doing letter writing, speaking at board meetings, all of that is essential, absolutely. But also building those relationships among people is really at the center of the work, because without that, again, pointing to NJ21 United's toolkit, without those shared values and establishing them and understanding, who's in the room, we're not actually really going to be able to move forward. It's just going to be just a bunch of individuals who just happen to kind of be moving in the same direction rather than a coordinated mass. So I really appreciate being able to have these conversations. And I think I wanted to say earlier, and I forgot, but just a remembrance of the Amistad Law, which was passed in 2002, so it's coming up in 20 years, which requires that African-American history is infused in the K-12 curriculum across the state. Again, coming up on 20 years, we're not seeing it. I'm imagining people would agree with me who can represent different districts in this room right now, that it's not being taught. And right, imagine, and that's really in alignment with critical race theory, if we're talking about teaching true history, right? So not just that Black Americans were slaves, and that's pretty much it. Another one of my student teachers, when we were debriefing after I observed her, and her cooperating teacher as well, and the cooperating teacher happened to mention that Reconstruction comes at the end, I believe, of US History 1. And another one of my student teachers for 8th grade said that her cooperating teacher had to kind of quickly go over Reconstruction before he could move to the next part that was actually in the curriculum because of the pandemic and the students really not getting as much as the content. And Reconstruction is such an important period in US history where we saw Black Americans being elected into positions. We saw Black Americans being able to build our own schools and lead our own communities, and all of that pretty much being dismantled through the same sort of white power structures and white supremacy that we're seeing today. And with Tulsa, right, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street being an extreme example, but not the only example of white terror on thriving Black communities. So imagine if in 2002, or the 2002-03 school year, districts across the state of New Jersey actually started to move toward implementing the Amistad legislation. Children of all races, colors, creeds, religions, so on and so forth, would have started to get an understanding of the contribution African Americans have made to this country and what we've actually overcome beyond just slavery. Right, that seems to be the prominent story about us, and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and that's pretty much where it gets to. And not that we've actually made a lot of different contributions in a bunch of different areas of life. So I just wanted to kind of end with underscoring that. And so maybe an action folks can take is getting a better understanding of how Amistad is being implemented in their district or not, and start asking some questions of the school and district leadership. So thank you.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
and
Kristen, go ahead.
I'll jump in. Again, thank you all so much. Thank you, Ellen, for the invitation to include NJ21 in this. And thank you for just hosting this space too, to have these conversations, because it's just so crucial and it's going to become even more important, I think, in the coming years. There was a lot of talk today just about how important it is to come together as this united front to approach this as an issue in schools. And that's something that NJ21 feels is so important. I think it's really, really unfortunate that NJEA and AFT-NJ aren't doing more about this in the state of New Jersey, and nationally we're seeing the same thing. But we can't just sit back and let the union, not do anything. We need to now step up and take it on by ourselves. And that's why it's so important that we have groups like NJ21 and NEW doing this work in the schools, in the communities on that ground level. I do want to shout out 2 other organizations that are in their communities organizing students and organizing families. Make the Road New Jersey, like I said, they're really spearheading the Police Free Schools Coalition, and they're doing a fantastic job of organizing youth leaders. They're giving them organizing trainings, and they're getting them ready to take on these big fights. And New Labor is also doing a ton of organizing work. They're one of our partners on the Protect NJ Workers Coalition. And then outside of the health and safety and the workers' rights, they're also in New Brunswick and in Lakewood and in different parts of Monmouth and Ocean County, organizing their communities, organizing parents, organizing students. And we need to have more of these coalitions, more of these groups working together, because that's how we build solidarity. And that's how we're going to confront not just this right-wing attack, on public education, but like Manny kept saying, it's how we're going to ultimately confront capitalism and white supremacy and all of these structural systems that just aren't working right now. So, follow NJ21. We're on Facebook. That's where we post most of our stuff. We are also an official membership caucus, if that's something you're interested in. We do a ton of work, and we're really excited to just keep doing this work with all of you and all of the other organizations that we've worked with.
Awesome. Manny, did you have any last comments you wanted to make?
I'll just be short. Thank you so much, Ellen, and everyone for being in this conversation. That's it.
That is short and sweet. Okay, well, I want to really thank everybody for coming out tonight. And just a reminder, if you want to follow up on our future events, you can go to againstendlesswar.org, and there's a place there for joining our mailing list, so that you can get the announcements of upcoming events. So let's give a round of applause virtually or whatever. Can unmute and clap for all of our speakers. Did a fabulous job. We really appreciate them taking the time on a Saturday night to do this. So we hope to see everybody again soon, and it's great to connect with everyone. I'm sure there'll be opportunities for us to be working together on stuff in the future. There's a lot to be worked on. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you again, and we'll see everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night, y'all.
Good night.
Thanks. Good night.